Good evening, everyone. My name is Lawrence J. I'm the director here at Rolling Ridge, and we welcome you to this next edition of our Divine Friendship series as we look at the Cloud of Unknowing by an anonymous 13th century mystic. Alan Dillingham will be our presenter this evening, and we hand it over to Alan, who will lead us into this cloud of unknowing and hopefully reveal a little bit more so that we can know more to learn that how much we really don't know. And so I hand it over to Alan, who will lead us in our time. Alan, it's all yours.
Thank you, Lawrence. I first encountered the Cloud of Unknowing about 30 years ago, and it was one of those things where it's like, oh, that's something I've got to read. And it's sort of been in the back of my mind to read it for all that time. And I've used this series as the prod to actually get me to read it. So Sandy's ahead of me, having read it twice. I've read it through once, although heavily marked up and thought and contemplated over. And what I'd like to do is start with an introduction to go fairly quickly through the basic ideas and concepts that pop out, and then to have a time for questioning, because I know that I've oversimplified a lot of these ideas, and the ideas are simple, but they're not easy. And what we know about the Cloud of Unknowing was what is written by, we believe it was written by a cloistered monk. It was written in England sometime in the latter half of the 1300s. Something about the 1300s and mysticism in Europe really sort of come together. I don't know if it has to do with the plague or anything like that, but there you have it. When approaching the Cloud of Unknowing, I'd asked you to keep in mind three concepts that are central. The first is the cloud of unknowing. The second is the cloud of forgetting. And the third is the prayer word. And if you have an understanding of those three, you've basically got the book. It's a fairly short book. As I said, the ideas are fairly simple, but they're not easy. The book starts off really with advice to someone who wants to be a contemplative. And the starting point is, for the contemplative, is not the intellect, but the fusion of the heart and the will in something the author describes as, quote, the naked intent, unquote, for God. So you start with the heart and the will rather than the mind. And what you aim for is just God. When the humble heart seeks to contemplate God's very self, apart from all his goods, all his works, it encounters a barrier, a darkness, a cloud of unknowing. This is a quote from chapter 3 that explains it a little bit more. This darkness and this cloud is betwixt thee and thy God, and thou mayest neither see him clearly by light of understanding in thy reason, nor feel him in sweetness of love in thine affection. I'll read that again just so it can stay with you. This darkness and this cloud is betwixt thee and thy God, and thou mayest neither see him clearly by light of understanding in thy reason, nor feel him in sweetness of love in thine affection. So when you look for God and you look for just God, this naked intent for God, you're going to find this thing the author calls a cloud of unknowing, that it's something, it's a layer between you and God. The cloud of unknowing is also the place where the contemplative encounters God, and one should strive to stay in this darkness for as long as one can, continuing to cry out in love to God as one does so. Now, this is hard work, to stay in this cloud of unknowing or to return to it. It is a place where God cannot be fully thought, but where he can be fully loved. By continual work, one can rise higher and higher away from sin and nearer to God. If one reaches this cloud of unknowing, one should try to stay there or get back there by putting what the author calls a cloud of forgetting beneath oneself and between oneself and all created things. So you attempt to get to God, you encounter this cloud of unknowing, but then you also have to, in a sense, detach from all created things and put them under this, what the author calls this cloud of unknowing. I'll read a quote from chapter 5. For although it be good to think upon the kindness of God and to love him and praise him for it, yet it is far better to think upon the naked being of him and to love him and praise him for himself. Instead of looking below yourself to all the creatures and works of God, focus on looking above yourself to the darkness of the cloud of unknowing. Try to pierce the darkness above you with a sharp dart of longing love. That's a quote from chapter 6, a sharp dart of longing love. And do not be concerned about what is below you, however good it may be. So to expand a little on this cloud of forgetting, the author would recommend putting visions of angels and saints and visions of heaven under this cloud of forgetting. Put the passion of Christ under this cloud of forgetting. Quote from chapter 9, surely he that seeketh God perfectly, he will not rest finally in remembrance of any or angel or saint that is in heaven. So the idea of this cloud of forgetting is to try to stay in this place where you might encounter God, in this cloud of unknowing. You have to let go, you have to forget about all other things. So with the cloud of unknowing, God is above you. With the cloud of forgetting, all other things are below you. And you're in this sort of no man's land. Really, that's not that's my term. That's not the author's term, but it's this place where you try to encounter God, and in trying to encounter God, you try to see God himself, not just his goods, not just his creatures. Put all thoughts of creatures under the cloud of forgetting, but primarily yourself. And the author suggests that you will find, when you have forgotten all creatures and even yourself, there shall still be between you and God a naked feeling of your own being. But this feeling is normally only fleeting. So you let go of all things, and yet somehow you find something, some sense of your own being in this cloud of unknowing. The author recommends using a short prayer word like God or love to put oneself between the cloud of unknowing and the cloud of forgetting. Don't study or be preoccupied with words or knowledge, for spiritual communion will not come from study, but from grace. No other words are needed because this little single word represents God in all his fullness and nothing less than the fullness of God. So the author's point here is that if you try to put too many words behind your prayer, you're actually moving farther from God rather than closer. And if you could concentrate all of what's meant by God into that single word, that will be enough. Or actually, he recommends a prayer word, but even a single prayer word may be one word too many. You're really sort of reaching out there and going beyond the known. It is the shortest prayer that pierces heaven, the author writes in chapter 37. And from chapter 7, he writes, "This word shall be thy shield and thy spear. With this word thou shalt beat upon the cloud, on this cloud, and this darkness above thee. With this word thou shalt smite down all manner of thought under the cloud of unknowing." So the prayer word is meant to help get you to the cloud of unknowing and to also get you to the cloud of forgetting, to get you to that space. One cannot presume to do this work without first cleansing the conscience. Those who have been great sinners before undertaking this work will find the work harder, but oftentimes they will make further progress more quickly than those who have not. And this is the work of God. This is by grace of God. After having been cleansed, the thought of prior sin may come up, or new stirrings to sin may come up. They should all be put under a thick cloud of forgetting. As often as these stirrings arise, they should be beaten down. If you can't beat these stirrings under the cloud of forgetting, the author recommends two devices. First, keep looking up towards the cloud of unknowing. The second is to actually surrender to these stirrings and acknowledge your weakness. This weakness is an invitation to God's grace. Prayer for the author of the Cloud of Unknowing is nothing else but a devout intent directed to God for getting good or removing evil. When the object is getting good, the prayer word God or love is appropriate. If the focus is on removing evil or purifying or cleansing oneself, the author recommends using sin as the prayer word, or having two words like sin out. And he recommends not focusing on a particular sin or vice, because this will have the effect of drawing you further from the cloud of forgetting. Just recognize that sin is there. Instead of contemplating your own sins in detail, think of sin as a lump, the author recommends, an obstacle to reaching the cloud of forgetting. And this lump is nothing other than yourself. So, whereas we saw with Francis de Sales, there was quite a bit of an examination of conscious and an examination of one's sinfulness and how one could correct and how would do better. For the author of The Cloud of Unknowing, the idea is, okay, recognize it's there and then forget it, because it keeps you from getting to that cloud of unknowing. It is hard work to put everything under the cloud of forgetting, but it is done with the help of grace. Also, one cannot break through the cloud of unknowing by one's own efforts. Only God can do this. So you can bring yourself to the cloud of unknowing, but then you're kind of stuck there until God acts. And the author recommends that if you're seeking God, you will find him, but the action itself is God's. It's God's grace. God is the one who will pierce the cloud of unknowing. The author writes that God will sometimes send a beam of ghostly light to penetrate the cloud of unknowing and show some of his private self to you, which may not and cannot be spoken. Then will your affection be inflamed with the fire of God's love. But again, remember, this is the work of God. You know, you work to get there, but God is the one ultimately who has control when you're in this cloud of unknowing. Now, the author recommends doing this work of contemplation continuously. Do it as much as you can. As he writes, don't exercise any discretion using it. There's always a good time to be doing this. In fact, do it all the time. He draws on the story of Martha and Mary from Luke's gospel to assert that it is a mistake to think that one should not embark on a contemplative life without first taking care of one's material needs. God, it seems, will stir the actives to support the contemplatives. God will provide the contemplative either an abundance of necessities or strength in body and patience in spirit to bear up under the need. Now, the author recommends that this book is not meant for everybody. It is recommended really only for those who are seeking a contemplative life. So it's a pretty austere vision. In fact, the author recommends not showing this work to anyone who isn't willing to, in a sense, go all in on this. I think for ourselves, most of us who are not full-time contemplatives and don't intend to be, there are still things we can gather from the ideas of the cloud of unknowing and recognize the challenge that it presents. And that's basically my presentation. And I'd like to take this time to take any questions you might have that would give me an opportunity to expand a little bit more on these ideas and what they might mean from my particular reading of this text.
Hi, Ellen. This is Jill.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was thinking while you were describing the cloud of unknowing and also the cloud of forgetting, it just struck me that maybe on some level do you think this is calling for some form of meditation? What is the relationship of meditation, I guess, is my question.
Well, that's interesting because there's a lot of different ways one could describe meditation. I think with the cloud of, in some ways it's meditating and it's not meditating. It's trying to get to a place that's beyond thinking. Thinking won't get you there. What gets you there is desire, is the will to be there, is the naked intent for God. So to the extent that one meditates, that might be preparation for this type of work, but it's not really the work itself that the author discusses. Does that make any sense?
Right. So you're saying there's actually an action of wanting?
Desire.
Is that
yes.
Desire, a desire.
Yeah. It comes from the heart and it comes from the will together, acting together. More than the mind.
Right. Which is why I thought meditation, because that's beyond the mind. I mean, in meditation, you take an action of going beyond the mind.
Yes, seeing meditation in that sense, yes, then they would be, yes.
Mm-hmm.
There are some definitions of meditation that involve more thought than others.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say meditation, if you're thinking getting beyond thought, then the answer is yes, that's what this is about. If your answer is trying to reach God through thought, then that might be preparation for this type of work, for this type of contemplation, but isn't the contemplation itself.
Alan, I'm very excited about your presentation because I guess in the intervening years, I have read like Keating's book on centering prayer and others on centering prayer. And it seems to me that they must have read this book. I'm sure they did.
Yes.
But I think that those books, having read them, will make this one, now that I'm going to take up the challenge of reading it, much easier. That's my sense from what you said, because there's many elements that seems to me in common. And so that's my first comment, is that makes it very exciting to go back and read this all the way through. The other thing I'm wondering about the cloud of forgetting, and I just need a little clarification, because to me that seems like a buffer, and it could be just like a buffer wall as an image. And it could be, they say put your thoughts underneath the cloud of forgetting, but it could be like keep them behind a wall, so to speak, or you're in the space and God is on one side. The wall of forgetting is a buffer to keep out, with the help of your one word, to keep those thoughts on the other side as much as possible. Is that, I may not be saying that well.
Yeah, what you're trying to do in this work is go go beyond what we often think of as contemplation or mysticism, which involves, like going out and seeing God in nature. This approach would say, forget about nature, put nature behind you, because that can actually get in the way of this sort of pure intent for God. Now, he doesn't say don't, well, he says, put things under the cloud of forgetting. And it's one method. It's certainly not the only method, but it is the method that this particular author is recommending in this particular book.
In the centering prayer books that I've read, they also say intent is key. Your yearning or your intent is key. So that kind of helps reinforce that idea to me. Just one more quick question. I take it that because when this was written, it's non-inclusive language.
Yeah, that's pretty much true. Yeah, so it's barely English, depending on the translation you get. It's not an easy read. The ideas are simple, and if you keep in your mind the cloud of unknowing, the cloud of forgetting, and the prayer word, and be thinking about that when you read it, it will help in the reading of the text. But the text itself is challenging.
Thank you.
Yeah, Belinda.
If I could just make a comment, I guess I didn't understand at the beginning when you said the ideas are simple, but it's not easy. But after hearing your presentation, I think I'm starting to get it. These are really kind of, they're simple, but it sounds like it is hard work and takes a lot of focus to get to that place, to that cloud of unknowing and contemplating the cloud of forgetting. Something that you said stood out for me, that you can't presume to do this work without first cleansing the conscience. So I had kind of the same question about Jill, is meditation a practice? And Patricia sharing about centering prayers. How would you describe that cleansing of the conscience? I'm kind of a highly strung person, so even just to sit and do a designed prayer for me really requires a lot of me. So to move myself to the place that you're describing with this cloud of unknowing, I think I would need a lot of preparation. So I'm interested to hear what kind of practices of this cleansing of the conscience, what can help you get more prepared? I heard you say do it all the time, and every time I thought, well, gosh, this sounds like a lot of work to get to this place. So ideas about that. And then I have one practical question. I was just looking up the book on Amazon, and I have a Kindle. I like to do things digitally because it's hard for me to get physical books where I am. But the Kindle version had an author to it. It was someone it was edited by someone rather than just the anonymous. So that's just a practical question, even maybe for Larry at the end. How can you recommend digital versions of the book itself for us? But my first question is the more important one. How do you get there? How do you cleanse your conscience and prepare for this kind of experience and movement towards this cloud of unknowing?
There is a chapter where he recommends for beginners reading, thinking, and praying. So reading what others have written and scripture is a good place to start. Thinking, meditating on it, and then praying. But he sees these as preparatory work and says that in a sense, the advanced contemplative, if you will, won't need that. And the idea is to move beyond it. But the author recognizes that, for the beginners, you do need a start. You do need something to sort of help you get going. And that's what he recommends: reading, thinking, and praying. And that's somewhere in the middle of the book. I almost put it in my notes, but I didn't want to. I thought that was better to take in questions. Like, like you did. And the version that I've read was edited by Evelyn Underhill, who was a well-known scholar of mysticism. The translation, though, it's from 13th century English, and her translation itself is now about 100 years old.
Wow.
So, and she was English. So I think some of the words there that might have been more familiar to people 100 years ago will be more difficult for us today. I know there's a popular translation by Ira Pogroff, which I think is probably the most common one and the most recent one. But I haven't read that particular one, so I can't tell you if it's any better. But I can tell you it can be difficult reading.
Thank you.
Yeah. Were there other questions about the presentation or the text that I might be able to expand on before we move into a period of contemplation and discussion? In that case, I'd like to turn it back over to Lawrence to moderate the program from here as we go on.
Thanks, Ellen. As you mentioned in the first part of in your presentation, a major focus of the Cloud of Unknowing is really moving from our head to our heart. It's really kind of recognizing that our head tends to kind of moderate a lot of where we are, but if we really want to kind of get to live in that space of the unknowing between the cloud of forgetting, it is really kind of entering into that space. And just to kind of build upon some of the things that Alan was talking about in terms of spiritual practices, I think in many ways, mindfulness practices are often really about kind of getting out of our mind, so to speak, and really kind of being in that place of stillness and rest where we tend to empty our mind, so to be in the presence of God. And to be able to be in that space where there is simply that openness. And I think a lot of contemplative work and meditative work is really about kind of entering in that space where we move beyond words to a simple openness of presence. And how we experience that openness of presence really will take different forms. Oftentimes, centering prayer uses a word so that that word almost becomes like a nothingness, so that it leads us into a place where our minds are being focused on kind of like a laser so that we can enter into that darkness, that unknowing and whatnot. And for those of us who live in 21st century where there's so much words going on, getting into that space of emptiness, so to speak, that letting go can be very difficult. And that's where I think, as Ellen's been emphasizing, it's simple, but it's very difficult. So as we kind of move into a time of reflection, let us just kind of move into a time of silence, to take all the words that we've heard and to kind of hold them with empty hands as we sit with some silence, and then move into a place where we allow what the Spirit has been bubbling in our hearts to be able to be shared within this context and with this group. So again, we're going to be moving from the questions and the listening to the space of what is being stirred in your heart as you've heard about being in that place between the unknowing and the forgetting. But before we move into that time of sharing, let's settle into that time of rest and a time of silence. And so I've got my little little bell here. And so we'll probably take about 2 minutes of just simply centering into a time of silence. And so as you are able, put your feet on the floor. Imagine a little rope pulling you up so that you're sitting straight. Close your eyes or lower your gaze and begin to breathe in and out, in and out. If a word comes to your mind or a thought or an idea, just simply breathe it out and be present in this moment and this space, knowing that it is full of grace, knowing that it is moving beyond words into a place of presence where the divine love of God dwells. I invite you to begin to open your eyes and be present in this moment. That was about 2 minutes. And what we're going to do is we're just going to simply open up this time for you to reflect upon what is stirring in your heart. That was only 2 minutes of trying to enter into that cloud of unknowing, or between into that space of the unknowing and the unforgetting. What was difficult for you about moving into that space? What has been stirring for you as you've heard Alan share, not from your head, but what is stirring in your heart? I know that people were talking about how they're at a place right now where they feel like they're in that unknowing. How has this experience, these last hour, 45 minutes or so, really spoken to you, and what is God stirring? I invite you to unmute yourself, and if you want to remain on your video off, you're more than welcome to do that. But I invite you to unmute yourself and to begin to speak into the space, knowing that it's safe and sacred and is held in the arms and the presence of those who are with you this day. Darlene, go ahead.
I want to apologize. I had the time wrong on my calendar. But I have read The Cloud of Unknowing. And when I started in contemplative prayer, maybe almost 30 years ago now. And I wanted to say that I learned somewhere along the way that the sacred word just stopped working for me. When you're new at something, you don't know what you're doing? And so I picked a word that was a trigger for me. So it just never worked. And then in our group, we read a book, and it's a student of Father Keating, and you would know his name, but it's not coming to me. But he talked about the sacred glance and some other things too. And then I just wanted to share that if you have something that you can picture, that just nothing can enter your mind when you see that image, you will find that place of transition. For me, I had a near-death experience, and Jesus was just right there in the ER with me, and he was really big. And so when I can go into that stillness, because that image of him works for me so powerfully. And it can be anything. I mean, it can be your child. It can be anything. But for me, the holy image of Christ, I really go into that place, that forgetting piece. I forget myself. And that forgetting myself is what gets me to be in that still quiet. And sometimes it's sad. Sometimes it's hard. A powerful place. So I wanted to share all that. And I love the text. And thank you, Ellen. And I'm so sorry I got the time wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Darlene. I appreciate that, because sometimes, as Ellen was saying, it is going beyond words. And sometimes in our day and age, as we are so visual, sometimes that image can actually be larger than the word. And if that image is so large, we can then get lost in that to move into that cloud of forgetting and that cloud of unknowing. So thank you. Sandra?
I want to thank you, Ellen. I thought that was such a lovely presentation. And as I have understood the book, you really expressed it so nicely and answered questions so beautifully. I just want to say a little bit about my own experience. When it comes to the lump, I love the lump of sin, because I'm one of those ones who, over the years, as a person of faith, how many times can we list our sins and go through them? So, it gets a little crazy. So I image that lump of sin as an owl pellet, and myself as an owl sitting in the tree. And there's a lot of owl pellets down there. But when I'm praying or contemplating, or however I want to describe it, no. I can't mess with those owl pellets. They're so interesting to dissect, but I can't. And the thing for me that's simple and that I remember and that gives me comfort about the cloud is that yearning and not knowing and not doing it on our own effort is everything. And sometimes that yearning is like an assault against the cloud. I think he might describe that, we persevere, we assault the cloud, we want to know. And sometimes it's a great comfort to sit under that cloud and not know. The forgetting cloud is a little harder for me. And I think as I'm getting older, I have a lot of fear of dementia because that runs in the family, and my mother died of that. And I'm starting to forget what's normal for my age, I think, nothing abnormal. But in a way, getting older makes the cloud of forgetting easier. So I see that as a little bit of a blessing. Like I can detach, even though I love my grandchildren and do everything I can for them, I can detach from them a little bit easier. You know, I don't get my esteem and self-image from them like I did my kids, in that sense of detachment. And it's more the cloud that I'm yearning and knocking and asking. So I think I have a lot to learn about the cloud of forgetting. And thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for your honesty and for your reflections. And in some ways, we can imagine a big picture of an owl and lots of pellets all over the place.
I was just contemplating, well, in that couple minutes of silence, of sort of letting go, kind of a practice, the practice of letting go all the different things that were coming into my mind, into my thoughts, and really observing that too. I think it's hard for me because I am such a meditator to sort of put a different spin on it, like the cloud of unknowing, but maybe and I don't know why, but I see it as very similar. But I just appreciated that there was a moment in the time that we were silent where it just seemed like doors were opening. There was a greater sense of consciousness. Something new can come in. A different type of energy can sort of pierce your mind stream and the conditioned mind. And I was just really rejuvenated by that. That was great. And also I wanted to ask, I thought that wasn't this whole evening under the umbrella of divine friendship? Mm. And we haven't mentioned that yet. And I was wondering what the connection is with it.
Thanks for bringing that up, Jill. And so I looked it up and I forgot to mention it. And so as we look at this idea of divine friendships, it comes from Teresa of Avila, who talks about 3 types of divine friendships. The original divine friendship is the friendship of the Godhead between the Father, Son, and Spirit, or however we want to understand those 3 aspects of the Trinity. The second aspect of the divine friendships is our relationship with the Godhead. And the third type of divine friendship is our friendships with one another, those who are our fellow sojourners in journey on, who are fellow sojourners on the journey to the deeper space with God. And so the intention has been to be able to kind of use the writings to reflect on how this contemplative classic speaks to these different types of divine friendships. And of course, I forgot to bring that up. And so that's a wonderful transition for us to be able to kind of move into some more reflections on how what Alan has reflected on in regards to the cloud of unknowing, how that relates to the divine friendship within the Godhead, our friendship with God, and then our friendship with one another. And so I invite any reflections on any of those 3 or anything else that has bubbled from the time that we've had. And I do thank you, Jill, for your sharing about your openness about the fact that when we begin to move to that place of opening up to presence, we never know what comes in. Even when we're online in silence together, the Spirit still is able to work.
Thank you.
The theme divine friendship, I sort of thought of that as a way to organize these disparate contemplatives and mystics. And with each one of them, I sort of struggle with the concept. I don't know what the author of The Cloud of Unknowing would have to say about divine friendship. He'd be more saying, get into the cloud of unknowing. And, you know, friendship might be a concept that's too limiting from this perspective of this author. You know, that's I'm having trouble making that connection myself with some of these authors, and it maybe I'm hoping that the group would have thoughts too, and that would stimulate thoughts about how that connect, because it is about prayer is about our relationship with God, and we can see that as friendship. And how does this particular work speak to that? I'm not really sure, but I'm asking the question for the group.
For me, acceptance might be a better word than friendship in this model. That I'm allowed to sit there and everything's okay. And I don't know, but I sometimes receive a comfort that is also unknown and unexplainable, and I don't deserve, but it calls me to go back. I wouldn't consider myself a friend.
I think God would be pleased if we set aside time just like we do with other friends. If we were unwavering in setting aside time to be in that space where God could love us as a friend would love us. So I think that's probably important for me. And I know sometimes I wanted, you know, my intent was to set aside like 20 minutes. But, you know, 10 minutes in, I was still not able to forget, you know, have things in the forgetting category. They were still on my mind. And I had an advisor once that said they themselves were just kind of getting into the cloud at 10 minutes, where I was at 10 minutes, I was pretty much set to give up or start over, you know. And so that was really helpful to me, because I find just setting the time aside and the yearning is good, but the actual practice can be very challenging. And I thought, well, his advice was good. Don't just give up.
Hi, I think today I think of God as probably a best friend for me. I have a lot of friends. I have a lot of good friends, but sometimes they're not available. And I just have a sense that I could always go to this God of my understanding and ask for help. You know, for me, this meditation over the years, I've tried to learn how to do it. And I like what you said, Patricia, because somebody a long time ago said to me, when all that noise starts coming in, just keep pushing it away. And I just found tonight with our 2 minutes that I did have all kinds of activity trying to jump in. And I just sort of let it go. I listened for a minute or for a second, and then I just try to kind of push it away. And I enjoyed it. I thought it was like almost 10 minutes. Then I heard the little bell and the bong, and I thought, my goodness, it was only two minutes. But I guess that means at least for tonight, I'm maybe getting a little better with this because I really enjoyed it. I felt very peaceful. And I have had the experience in the past where there's this sense sort of pushing away a little bit, pushing away. And then it's almost like I drop down into something. And I'm wondering, maybe that's the beginning of forgetting.
Mm-hmm.
That confused me when Alan was explaining that, Alan, but then you answered a question and it made a lot more sense for me. I think I was overthinking it, but it's been a discipline for me. It is a lot of hard work. And I wonder if, and maybe Alan, you can answer this, has this anything to do with the dark night of the soul on any level? The hard work and the darkness? I think I've been there too.
Having not yet read The Dark Night of the Soul, I'm reluctant to make comparisons. This seems to be a little different.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
But you know, I think all of these mystics, you know, they're like blind people trying to describe an elephant. You know, yeah. So I think the term cloud of forgetting may get you part of the elephant that's behind the cloud of unknowing. And the dark night of the soul is sort of another aspect.
Yes. Yeah.
From what I understand of what I've heard about the dark night of the soul, it's more about suffering as part of the process, and the cloud of unknowing talks about work and effort, but not so much about suffering. Really,
right,
as a means to that. It's, you know, it's more focused on the desire in the heart and the will to want to meet God, and to meet God, you know, not just God's creation, but God's very self. You know, how do we come in contact with God's very self? Surprisingly, not a lot is said in the Cloud of Unknowing about suffering. Other mystics will talk more about it, but this is more about desire. It is about work.
Yeah.
It is about effort.
That might have been where I confused it, because yeah, you're right. Thank you.
But really, I think for this whole series, it's more important what we take from each of the mystics. You know, they're like, they have a particular understanding. It gives us a particular tool that may or may not be useful for us. Personally, I realized going through the Cloud of Unknowing that I am just not a contemplative. You know, if you know, this idea of trying to get to the Cloud of Unknowing and the Cloud of Unforgetting and this no man's land and sitting there and saying God all day, you know, you know, it's hard. I can see where that would be a path for someone, and that would, you know, that for some, you know, that I can see how this would be appealing to people who are contemplatives. And, you know, I think we're all sort of mix of active and contemplative. But, you know, I'm not ready for sort of the hardcore boot camp that the author of The Cloud of Unknowing recommends, but I can take a little bit of the lessons from, you know, The Cloud of Unknowing. Yep, I can say that I've encountered that. The Cloud of Forgetting, I've tried to encounter that. The prayer word, yeah. Yeah, that's all useful, but I don't know that I'd sign up for the whole program.
Right, I agree. I think so. Thank you.
Yeah.
Your humility is refreshing, Alan, and it's very encouraging for those of us who are beginners and also may struggle with some of these practices. I like what you said about taking the pieces from the mystics. It's not that we have to commit to a full program if you want. And I love the boot camp analogy, but finding the practices that work and that we can develop in this time, in our time.
Yeah, the author himself is a little ambivalent. I mean, and sometimes he talks about beating against the cloud of unknowing, and sometimes it's sort of just a gentle, joyful persistence.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the newer books are not so much on board with the beating part. It's more the other persistent, joyful part that these days I'm thinking.
I've been thinking about something that you said at the very beginning, Alan. You just kind of referred to the mysticism that was present in the 13th century and the plague and the relationship between that. And as I've read about that time frame, I think there's some truth there. And I wonder what that says to us today as we go through a similar situation with a pandemic, a global pandemic. And how do we respond to that? And we have such different perspectives across the whole Christian community. There's so many different perspectives on this whole question of the pandemic and what is happening. And I just find it very interesting. The other thing that came to me is the reason that I know Belinda is from travels in Nicaragua. And I've learned a word there that stays with me a lot, and it's called accompaniment. And my divine friendships with other people are out of that accompaniment relationship. People that have accompanied me as I traveled in Nicaragua, and also as I've accompanied others. And I was thinking about that in relationship to God, and how is it that God accompanies me? And how do I accompany God in the midst of all of this?
Thank you, Sharon. There's something about our own relationships with other people and that divine friendship that can help create and shape what a divine friendship with God is about. So as we understand that other people accompany us, it's living into that sense of being accompanied by God as well. And the same way that our friendships with people are not always full of words, or even when it comes to a partner or a spouse, sometimes the most intimate times that we have are wordless. And I think those same kind of experiences can also apply into that time of being in the presence of God, where we are living into that intimacy that moves beyond words, but is simply found in presence, where Missy talked about where we kind of drop, so to speak. We kind of descend into that space of comfort and grace, where we just have an overwhelming feeling that allows us to know that all will be well, even though there is so much that is unknown. And oftentimes those relationships with people can help not guide us, but can encourage us on that journey with God. And so thank you, Sharon, for sharing that. And so we do have a few more minutes if anyone else would like to share their reflections or thoughts. Guy, go ahead.
So what has been encouraging to me is, just the discussions of the contemplative ideas and centering prayer and the cloud of unknowing, because for most of the time that I've spent I've been in the Methodist Church for a long time. My church experience, I haven't heard of a way to experience God. We talk about God, in an intellectual way, but I think that's only a very small part of what I think the real usefulness of religion is. And we have to have a technique. We have to have a way to experience beyond words. And that's where, like, the Cloud of Unknowing and contemplative prayer are, I think, pretty exciting practices as a way to actually experience God beyond words, because that's where he is. And I think the effort here, to me, is finding the time to do it, to set aside that part of our day or a couple parts of our day to open ourselves up to the experience of God. And but the practice itself can't be hard. We have to let go. We can't use much effort. We just, as we were saying before, we need the yearning for it. And so anyway, those are some of my thoughts about the importance of what we've been talking about tonight.
I want to suggest that the author does suggest that the more you do this sort of work, the more you'll want to do it. Yeah, that in the doing it can be easier once you start doing it. Then when you make the room for it and you enter that space, and you're graced by whatever God graces you with in that time, it builds that desire.
Yeah,
so it's not all. So it's hard work, but it's not all hard work.
I think for those of us who are on the Richard Rohr Action and Meditation group yesterday, we were looking at the daily meditation where Rohr talks about falling in love, and that created all sorts of conversation right there about the idea of falling in love. And I think that kind of reflects a little bit about some of what we're talking about in terms of that falling into that divine space. And I think, Guy, just kind of to reflect a little bit about what you shared about Methodist spirituality, I think a lot of John Wesley's ideas about spirituality were very much focused on the head, about Bible studies and really learning more, as opposed to really throwing out all the words to simply be in presence. And I think that oftentimes does become a struggle within Methodism, where there's a lot of focus on intellectual understanding as well as social action. But when it comes to the heart condition, that oftentimes gets lost. And yet it was John Wesley that did ask that question, is how goes it with your soul? And I think most Methodists today oftentimes kind of lose that sense of asking that question, how is it with our souls? And hopefully we can kind of regain that again as we realize that it is through these contemplative practices where we kind of allow the bottom to fall out, so to speak, from what we know, and to fall into that space of presence and love. And
don't forget the strangely warmed experience, which was not a head experience.
Yeah, very good. I'm surrounded by some good Methodists. Thank you.
Yeah.
And so we have just a few more minutes to go. If anyone else would have anything else they'd like to share. And so before we kind of close up with a blessing and a prayer, we do want to kind of do our little advertisement plugs. And so next month we'll be shifting a little bit. We'll be looking at Saint Bonaventure and the mind's journey into God. We talk about unknowing and we talk about the mind's journey. And yet when we look at Bonaventure, the mind's journey reaches a point where the mind is useless and we enter into that point of unknowing as well. And so next month we'll be looking at St. Bonaventure as we move into the month of October, which is focusing on the Feast of St. Francis. And so we got a little bit of Franciscan theme going on next month. And for those of you who know me, you know that I've got a little bit of a Franciscan bent. And so I twisted Alan's arm to say, can we do a Franciscan author on the month of October? And so the second Monday in October, we'll be looking at St. Bonaventure's The Mind's Journey unto God. And then in November, we are looking at Meister Eckhart. And I don't know if Alan's completely focused in on what writing we're going to look at with Meister Eckhart. So just pay attention for that as it comes along. And so that's what we have coming up as we continue in our Divine Friendship series for the next few months. And so before we close it down, Alan, do you have anything else that you would like to share to kind of tie a nice little bow on this and make it all simple so we can be inspired and want to sit in some silence? And so.
Well, I was just going to suggest that whether we're Methodists or Catholics or Baptists, that there's a Christian tradition we can all draw on, and we can even draw on Buddhism and Hinduism, and we can be a bit carnivorous, I think, in religious terms, and take what practices seem to bear the most fruit for us. I think that's it. I think that's the best way to approach some of these classics, is to take what's useful for us today in our own lives. And, the ultimate test is whether they bring us closer to God and closer to each other.
Very good. Thanks, Alan. What I'm hearing is the truth that one size does not fit all. And so what we need to do is to know ourselves, to know our size, find the things that fit within our spiritual life, and to be able to embrace them, whether they come from the Christian contemplative classics like we're looking at here, or whether they come from other spiritual faith traditions. Bring what we have into that space where we can dwell and to be in the presence of God. And so as we begin to kind of wrap up our time together, let us hold in our hands and in our hearts all that we've heard this evening. May we, oh God, continue to fall into that space between the cloud of unknowing and the cloud of forgetting, and to be so caught up, whether with a word or a picture or something that reminds us about how big you are and how much we are loved. May we rest in that place of presence and grace, knowing that you will never leave us nor forsake us. And as we find ourselves through this pandemic, living into a time of unknowing that is very difficult and very hard, may we continue to press in and to listen into that silence for your heartbeat in our lives, reminding us that you are present, you are with us, and you are good. May we go from this time and this space into that cloud of unknowing and forgetting, living and being loved by you, O Jesus. For it's in your name we pray. Amen. Go in peace this evening. And as Darlene mentioned, we are going to have this available. Recording will be sent to you so that you can click it and you can relive this experience or share it with somebody else. And so have a good night, everyone. And hope we see you next month.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Goodbye.
you. Bye.